And next slide. We can also think about something like, in the next slide, the coltan mines in eastern Congo as a form of ruin, in the sense that global demand for these kinds of minerals suspends, for example, the Congo region in an indefinite state of civil war, militias, geopolitical and economic instability and violence. So that's a case where rather than something falling into disrepair, I'm talking about ruin in terms of things being left in limbo and being suspended in a state of instability and violence. Famously, this is where Sony once directly negotiated with a Rwanda-backed occupation militia force because they needed to secure their supply of coltan for the Christmas rush of the PlayStation 2. So this is about 20 years back, and things haven't gotten much better since. Right? So ruins are not just quiet places for dreams to fade into the night. They are actively created and maintained through the economic and geopolitical forces that we call at the moment AI. Ruins are not just about failure and obsolescence. They are places where theories about the future and about progress are actively produced. Next slide. So in that case, I want to talk today a little bit about what kinds of approaches to ruins and the future do we see today, and could we do things any differently? So the first thing I want to point out is that we often have a disavowal, this kind of denial. If you look at the dominant technological futures today, Mark Andreessen's Tech Optimist Manifesto and so on, Sam Altman saying that chatbots are going to help us get to the moon somehow. A lot of the times, what's involved there is an active, and I would argue, fearful denial of any possibility that their futures might also be subject to decay and deformation over the years. A very symbolic example of this, next slide, is what is called the clock of the long now, or the 10,000-year clock. This is where some of the most famous visionaries in the Valley, like Stuart Brand and Danny Hillis, came together. And then, most importantly of all, they somehow got Jeff Bezos to give them $42 million. Otherwise, this whole thing is not happening. And then they explicitly say they're not just building a clock, they're building a myth. What is the content of the myth? A clock that dings and bongs for 10,000 years as a monument to mankind's ability to predict and manage and rationally think about the future. So in some ways, it is a noble goal, right? I don't intend to criticize everything about it. But to me, something about that idea of predicting and thinking about the future, built into that is a denial of the possibility of ruin and the possibility of different ways of thinking in the future. In fact, a symbolic episode appears when they realize that if you need to build something to last 10,000 years, that's a pretty major engineering and architectural problem. They talk to some material scientists in Berkeley who tell them there is no known matter in the universe that we know of that's not going to decay and fall into ruin. What you could do is pick a material that, as far as we know, simply never changes state, which is a form of silicon carbide. That is what they're going with. Now, I think they know that it's unlikely that that means they've guaranteed non-ruin, but I think it's an interesting expression of, again, something that we see in a lot of these AGI-fueled projections today, where there's this idea that history runs up to the present day or 5 years or 10 years later, and then the reel stops. Singularity happens, or massive AI-driven automation happens, and then after that, it's sort of like after the end of the movie. Nobody knows what happens, but we think that Moore's law just extrapolates forever into the shining future. But I said that this disavowal is not complete. There's a fearful element to it, because the same tech elites that are funding these kinds of very hopeful, optimistic projects, on the side, for themselves and family and friends, they are more than ever funding bunkers and doomsday architecture for themselves. So if you look at the next slide, if you are only in the top 1% of the rich, poor you, that's not very much, is it? All you can do is you can only afford the ready-made corporate sold bunkers. You're one of the Joe Blocks. So you go to a company like Vivos, although if you can stretch your budget, you can add on optional add-ons like the swimming pool. And the interesting thing about these bunkers is that a lot of them revive the stylings or sometimes directly go in and retrofit World War II era bunkers. which is also something data centers are doing. They're going into these old bunkers, right? So there's this kind of literal superposition of one ruin from one era on top of another. Now, if you are not an average rich dude and you're more of the Bezos level, you don't want to do this. You want to build your own custom personal bunker, N of one. And in fact, you're so ambitious that you want to turn entire islands into a bunker. Larry Ellison, the CEO of Oracle, currently owns 98% of the land in Lanai, which is the 6th largest island in Hawaii. Next door in Waimea, Mark Benioff, the CEO of Salesforce, who used to be a mentee to Larry Ellison, owns a huge chunk of the Waimean island as well. Not all of it, because a big chunk is also owned by Mark Zuckerberg. Like his land there includes a reservoir. I don't know why he needs that bit, but there it is, right? So there are these ways in which they're looking at Pacific Islands as a way to escape what they fear will be complete societal ruin. The best example, and this guy's always the best, next slide please, it's Sam Bankman-Fried before everything blew up in his face. He wrote that he was going to buy the island nation of Nauru in the South Pacific. It's very unclear how he thought that buying an island, like buying a whole country works, but apparently that's what we're doing these days, Greenland and all that. And Sam Bankman-Fried, the reason he wanted to do this is because he thought there was a significant chance that, he wrote, from 50 to 99% of the world population might be wiped out by some combination of civilizational disasters in the near future. Ecological collapse, killer robots, combination of the two, whatever. So these guys are also driven very much by hugely apocalyptic visions. And Nauru is such an interesting choice that he made. I'm sure he didn't know about any of this. But when the Europeans, quote unquote, discovered Nauru and started looking at it closely in the 20th century, they discovered, like Congo, this is full of valuable minerals, phosphate in this case. So what they do over the 20th century is dig up almost the entire, it's not a very big island, entire island. For a brief period, this makes Nauru have the highest GDP in the world in the 50s, but it's not really their money. Money is just passing through in the global chain of capital. And so soon the money is gone, the soil is gone, the infrastructure is gone. Today, most Nauruans are in extreme poverty. A huge amount of the island's GDP actually comes from detention centers they run for the refugees that Australia does not admit into the country and then sends instead to Nauru. So there's all these layers of ruin that I think is going on here. And so the macro level propulsion along the atmosphere is these extremely rich tech elites combination of public disavowal and private fears about ruin and the future. Next slide, please. So that's one way of doing things, which is disavowal. If we look back historically at a moment when authoritarian and technological visions collide, we have a seemingly different strategy, although I would say that it's actually pretty similar. And this can be told very quickly through the story of Albert Speer, a young German architect who one day in 1933 sees an open competition to design rallying grounds for the new National Socialists in power. He submits not only an architectural blueprint, but he submits a drawing of what the place will look like as a ruin thousands of years later. Some of the upper level NS bureaucrats are scandalized. However, the big kahuna, Adolf Hitler, is very happy. You know that he thinks of himself as an architect of the nation, which to him is the same thing as the leader of the nation. And Hitler says, this is great. Why? Because he is really, really envious at that point of the fascist bro next door, Benito, who's got great Roman ruins all over the place to play up into this myth of the elective origin myth of the nation, where it's coming from and where it's going. And so Hitler brings on Speer. Speer eventually becomes one of the most powerful planning figures and leaders in the Nazi party. And he develops something called the theory of ruin value. Right? How can you manufacture and plan for wonderful ruins? And I would argue that there's actually a very similar thing going on here with disavowal, because again, this is a neurotic form of control and prediction and stasis, where thousands of years on, you want the same Aryan folks to come and look at these ruins and interpret them the way you wanted them to interpret it, right? So it's a very static vision of history. The irony, next slide please, the irony is that Speer never got to do this. He built very few monumental buildings, and when he did, they were all actually in concrete. And what you see is limestone cladding over the concrete. Why? Hitler kept saying, you got to build this in like 6 months and, you know, like impossible timelines. And then when the war began, there's material shortages and so on and so forth. So the irony is we don't really have any great ruins left behind by Albert Speer. In fact, for most of his final years of the war, he was busy building entire networks or planning entire networks of bunkers, right? So it just keeps coming round and round. At some point, they had to downgrade from bunkers to roads. Now, one reason I mention this piece of history in particular is because this kind of intersection or working through of manufacturing ruin and manufacturing the future, we are seeing today. One of the places we see it is in the tech elite funded cities of the future, AI-driven cities. One example, next slide please, is called Praxis. This is where Peter Thiel's money goes to a 27-year-old dude who used to be a hedge fund analyst, and then he was fired, and then he thought, screw that, I'm gonna do something much more exciting and ambitious, Western civilization, man. And he gets Peter Thiel's money and designs something called Praxis. Now, I think most of you, well, some of you will see the reference. This image here in the background, this is just Lord of the Rings fan fiction. This is just Minas Tirith, right? Which is the gleaming white, literally all white city in the novel that Tolkien himself called in one of his letters, don't ask me why I know that, one of his letters called his Constantinople. Right, so he's picking this. He's picking this very, very symbolic idea of a very narrow, selective view of Western history that he's going to reclaim from what I don't know. And if you look at the next slide, you'll see some of the posters that this guy's developing, which I think makes the associations clear, right? You're seeing the strict classicism, like Speer. Strict classicism is, some of you will know this much better than me, but this is where you don't know exactly which architectural style this is referring to, but it's sort of a mix that evokes a sense of, dude, this is old European stuff. You even have the use here of Fraktur, the Gothic font that was the official font of the National Socialist propaganda for the 30s. I don't think that means that there is this kind of direct ideological inheritance. Rather, I think this guy gets to the same destination as someone like Speer because he has the same impulse to look for a heroic, centralizing myth of nation history and future development, right? So to wrap up, next slide please, what I'm working on now is to try and see if we can develop a slightly different theory about ruins and the future, something a little bit more progressive, a little bit more redemptive, if you like. And I'm doing this, of course, through familiar figures like Walter Benjamin and Ernst Bloch. And the key thing that I'm taking away from them is they warn us already in the 40s that you cannot design a good future by trying to look at it directly. You can't look at it directly and say, I'm going to depict my idealized vision of society out there in the blank slate of the colony in Mars or the future city. Because if you do that, chances are you're producing a narrow and centralizing and authoritarian vision of what utopia is going to look like, because this is all being extrapolated. But you can do it differently by looking at the ruins of past futures, right? Ruins that are left behind by future ambitions that were abandoned or went through their era. Because if you do that, you develop what Bloch calls a concrete utopia. You develop a sense of how these things tend to go wrong, or how different voices and the people using it, how that interacts with the original vision. So what would the definition of AI look like if it didn't come from venture capital priorities and their ideas of optimization and scale and their very narrow science fiction field visions of eschatology? What if instead our idea of AI and our definition of it came from something like the COBOL-driven control stations that we still have in our airports and our subway centers? What about the American cities and the scars of redlining that they still have and inflict on the bodies that live in those cities? What about historical data points of workplace injuries in warehouses and factories? And what about all the diaries and novels and little pieces of culture we leave behind that don't talk about technological futures, but the kind of social relationships that we would like to have in our own lives? So there are many, many different ways in which we can recuperate from these past ruins, perhaps a different way of thinking about the future. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Sure. Okay, I get to introduce Johan. Okay, so Johan Fredrikzon is a researcher at the Division of History of Science, Technology, and Environment at KTH Royal University of Technology in Stockholm. He's currently a visiting scholar at Stanford University. In 2022 to 2024, he was a visiting postdoc fellow at the University of California, Berkeley. Fredrikzon holds a Master of Computer Science from Stockholm University, where he also received his PhD in History of Ideas in 2021. In his research, Fredrikzon has been interested in problems of erasure, disappearance, waste, and decay as conditioned by processes of data management, office work, and archival practices. During 2018 and during 2019, he was a research affiliate at Yale University. Fredrikzon's current research project is a 3-year study of the history of artificial intelligence from the perspective of errors and mistakes in humans and machines, respectively, funded by the Swedish Research Council. Go ahead.
Thank you. Sorry, do I just put this in share? All right, well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to this event. Special thanks to Professor Dunson, who invited me and hosted me during this academic year at Art and Art History. It's been really productive for you. So this is also work in progress. I'm hoping to submit this to a special issue on AI and memory, and we'll see how that goes. And looking forward to your comments. All right, so this is what I hope to be talking about today. And here, I want to investigate the roles of error and labor in speaking to the dead. I'll show you what I mean by that in a minute. So here's my argument. When our expectations of transcendental communication change, if we want to sustain the spiritual experience, I will say that we need to rethink the elements of error and labor. And so by error here, I mean things like disruption, malfunction, deviation, noise, interference. And by labor, I mean not only cognitive effort, but also sensorial and imaginative labor, psychic work, some might say. I'm going to talk about these things. They're known as dead thoughts. I don't know if you've heard of them, but they're basically digital simulations of deceased loved ones. And so the purpose is to prolong the presence of people who have passed away, prolong their presence among us. And so they're trained on massive amounts of data social media, email, notes, diaries, even video, things like that. And this is now they can be trained also on gestures and movements and so on. And it's a product now, so you can order and buy these things. Two basic types: either you have people who are participating in training sessions while they're still around, so they go into a company and they will get recorded and so on, or you have someone who passed away and then you give all this data to a company and they're going to create the simulation for you. And so the main bunch of critique here, obvious, some of it's pretty obvious, like what about the ethics, who owns them, what if the company goes out of business, what about prior consent, so on and so forth. But this is, I guess, it's the most common critique. So people, how is this going to help people let go? Maybe it's going to create the effect of something quite the contrary. But I'm going to focus on something slightly different. I'm going to talk about deadbots in the tradition of technological spiritualism, I call it. So I want to look at this longer tradition of trying to connect to the other side, if you will, using a range of technical contraptions. So since the 19th century at least, new technologies of communication and storage have been used to try to reach dead people. And so, inventors of these famous technologies, Scholz, Bell, Edison, they all thought that the typewriter, the telephone, and the phonograph could actually put people in touch with people, with dead people and spirits on the other side. And so they will say that we can practice something called spirit typewriting. Okay, that was a thing. Bell himself said that this apparatus seems to be possessed by something supernatural. And we have Edison, early 1900s, he says, I've been at work for some time building an apparatus to see if it's possible for the personalities which have left this earth to communicate with us. So this is a thing. And it's interesting to see that these technologies, typewriters, talking boards, phonographs, telephones, and so on, have served dual purposes. So on the one hand, very much like in the history of photography, they are helping us to get a more accurate and higher precision take on the world. They call it mechanical objectivity. On the other hand, there's something in the machine or the device itself that's slightly mysterious or unknown or even magical. I mean, after all, the phonograph undeniably did play back voices of the dead, and no one had ever heard that before. So, no wonder. And so, who knew what this ingenious apparatuses were capable of? And I think these productive contradictions, I call them, have been really important in the history of technological spiritualism. And of course, humans. I mean, the technology itself didn't do all this work on its own. So humans played an important role here as media or as mediums, right? And so equipped with these typewriters and telephones and phonographs and so on, they themselves were making these spirits come forth. And so aside from the skills of wielding the equipment, humans as mediums did much of the important work to interpret these messages coming from the other side, right? And I'm specifically interested in this thing. So this is, now we're in the 50s, 60s, 20th century. I want to situate these deadbots that I started out talking about in this long history, going back to the 19th century, but I want to make a special stop here with something called the electronic voice phenomena, or EVP. So this guy is Fredrik Jürgensen. He's a Swedish guy. He's a musician. He's a poet and painter also. And you can see in the quote here, he goes out and records things like the songs and sounds of wildlife, things like that. And so, but he starts hearing voices on these tapes, on these recordings. And so the tape recorder becomes a very important instrument for him here. It enabled new ways, right? This was a fairly new thing. It enabled new ways to record and play back, and you can cut and you can combine tracks. And so it's quite a creative medium at the time. And this flexibility of auditory editing was really important. And so this thing played a very important role for him to prove the authenticity of these ghostly recordings, right? And I won't sit down for a minute. Thank you. And so in many respects, the noise, I will argue, is the enabler of these kinds of signals to emerge. So it's really difficult to get these voices speak on the recordings he's making. And so listening practices are absolutely key. Lots of training, hours and hours of trying out the different techniques to make this work. So he's basically looking for signals in this oceans of noise, right? And so Jurgenson's EVPs in the 60s and 70s are part of this longer lineage, as I mentioned. But if we're talking about deadbots, I started talking about deadbots, right? And in these machine learning systems. And I think they are the newest example in this tradition. But one thing that makes it different, of course, is that the deadbots are deliberately, right, made to the purpose of communicating with the right. With the dead, right? And so the way it's done, they're training on data. We talked about that. Archives of loved ones who have passed away. The idea that people more or less are their data is certainly not new. And if you look at this guy, he's a really famous AI roboticist person. And this is what he says in the 80s already. He talks about the possibility of resurrecting dead people from the traces they leave in life, and he calls it a form of super archaeology. Right? And this is exactly what deadbots are doing now. So I think he captures this really well. And I want to suggest that we call it data vitalism, right? He calls it super archaeology. I want to call it data vitalism, because I think this is the notion that we have, that we can make people come alive just by stirring their data, so to speak, right? I started out by saying that I want to consider deadbots in the history of this technological spiritualism, and in the looking at specifically at problems of labor and error, right? So let's talk about labor first. I mean, if you recall the 19th century mediums that I talked about, these experts that are wielding the spiritual devices to connect to the dead, you know, they have a special skill set, they have a trusted role, and they have done all of these practices to make that happen. And the same thing with this guy here. So a huge effort to make anything at all interesting appear on these tapes, right? Like, don't assume that anything will come out. That this is very much a practice or a ritual. It's almost like a prayer, right? And I will argue that something very different is the case with deadbots. I mean, the labor here is, for the user is minimized. It's almost eliminated. I mean, the bot is pre-trained by a corporation. It's delivered to order, let's say. You know, in Moravic sense, we're trying to have the dead rise from the data. And so with deadbots, we're presenting with something like a role-playing performance with amazing fidelity and slickness, right? And so this is very much the dead at our convenience or leisure. No need really to develop special skills there. And I think that this loss or elimination of labor is connected to errors. And so if you look at the case with electronic voice messages again, he's working, let's say this guy's working in the face of noise, right? And disturbances in transmission. The tapes, the recorder, the environment, the air, the background radiation, magnetic failures, all these things, right? So again, this is very much a humanized medium in this sense. Whereas in deadbots, it's the other way around. The errors are minimized during training. The result is very much a statistical average. We're trying to find what someone might have said on a specific topic, what's likely, what's probable, and so on. So no need reason to find, we don't have ourselves to find the weak signals in this environment. And so what am I saying here? I mean, deadbots are part of this spiritual technology lineage, but I think they break by being deliberately designed to connect with the dead. And because people who want to communicate with the spirits, they don't really have to invest their own labor, okay? And so I think this is what I'm trying to capture by improbable and probable presence. So how could this be real? Is like the question you ask over here. How can this not be real? Is a very different question in the case of these dead bodies we're talking about. So that felt like a really nice, tidy conclusion for me. But then I started to think that maybe there's still room for something else in the case of dead bodies. So I want to talk about something that I call the activation of disbelief. So in a sense, this is the inverse of the more familiar suspension of disbelief, right? So what do I mean? I mean, instead of finding the message in the noise, maybe it's about finding the noise in the message, if you will. And so I mean that noise is that can be something completely unexpected or a puzzling utterance or a bunch of nonsense in this dead boy performance, even some garbled message that you can't really make out, so on. An area video out of sync or something like that. But I'm talking about an event to make that happen, like something that you would more expect from a real living person, really. I'm talking about a kind of way to insert productive errors in this dead body experience. But how are we going to do that? Well, my intuition, I guess, is that a simulation with ambitions to perform action beyond the grave must at some point break down in a way that makes room for faith at the expense of control. That's how I would put it. And I have a couple of examples of how you might do that. Well, for one thing, we have this hallucination, right? And we're all aware of these hallucinations. And they can happen, like if you turn up the temperature on the interaction with your dead bot, you can make it like less incoherent if you want to. So that's, there's one opportunity there to have it do things that weren't really, strictly following the script. Another way, I guess, is to adopt some sort of warped or queer prompting routine, where you can force the simulation of your loved one to really explore, let's say, the corners of the archive that they left behind. So the more distant traces they made in life. So my question would be, how to stir that really long tail, where the less coherent notes perhaps will reside in that. Some sort of deranged prompting, I'm not sure what that would look like. We can talk about that. And a third way, I guess, would be to draw on what my colleague Chris Haffenden has called self-made immortality. So these are really, let's say, the technologies of the self, that people use to manage their reputations or remains. And so I suggest that we can imagine some deviant form of that, where grandma, let's say, carries out a data poisoning attack on her own archive, like on her Google Drive or on her laptop or something like that, to introduce like bizarre or distorted pieces of data that's going to mess her archive up in a way that then when we go and see to the bot factory, we're gonna create her dead bot, it's actually gonna turn out to be a really twisted or confused simulation. That's another possibility. Like a bunch of hacking techniques that you can use to distort your own archive if you wanted to. So that's been a thing. Like in history, people have done that for hundreds of years for a bunch of different reasons. So these tactics then for me ways to mess with the simulated dead. And it's a way to bring back these productive contradictions that I talked about in the history of technological spiritualism. So the device not only will harbor this mechanical objectivity, but also something mysterious and magical, perhaps. So these techniques, then, hallucinations, queer prompting, or data poisoning, I would argue we can use to bring back the element of human media or human mediums in order to make sense of the communication with the cat. And this is my last slide, and I just wanted to point out that I think that the challenge with dead bots aside from all the obvious ethical and emotional problems that they might present that I mentioned initially, lies in our expectations. That we have a perfect tool that will keep people around in a convenient way. But I would rather follow John Dorn Peters in questioning this understanding of the very concept of communication, whether with things living or dead. So to Peters, the reason we think communication fails is that we expect too much. We expect it to be a union of souls, he will say. And we demand too much of it, and so we will always be disappointed, right? Instead, we might find that the value in this activity of communication is bound up with the effort that we ourselves invest into it. So if deadbots are to be of any use for us, we might have to rethink them and rework them into something that more resembles our loved ones and that don't just stand there as obedient ghosts awaiting our next prompt. And so if that sounds like a product that nobody wants, then perhaps that's a useful input for this whole space of simulating people. All right, thanks.
I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker. So Julia Irwin is currently a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Art and Art History at the Institute for Human-Centered AI at Stanford University. She researches the history and philosophy of artificial intelligence with a focus on the relationship between theories of intelligence and automation. Her writing has appeared in Grey Room, Film History, and Key Power. She holds a PhD in film media from UC Berkeley. So if you would like to share your screen. Yeah.
Everything good with the camera? All right, great. I'm gonna sit, if that's all right. Okay, so my talk is called William James's Neural Network, Fringe Consciousness and Historical Time. So popular discussions about artificial general intelligence and its impending arrival tend to take for granted what I like to call a mirroring and replacement condition. For example, the host of the podcast Hard Fork and New York Times tech reporter Kevin Bruce recently described working with OpenAI's Deep Research feature to conduct research for his upcoming book on HCAT. You have to go through my. I think we have to go through my speakers. Is that right?
Yeah.
The challenge is artificial general intelligence, and so I asked you research.
They are.
Yeah.
Is it possible to choose the other? Because there's speakers in here.
We did tech test it and it didn't work. It wasn't able to.
Change it. Is that to the speakers?
Is there only one person on the Zoom?
Oh, it's because you turned on your microphone. Wait, yeah, okay, now try playing.
Okay, well, I can read.
To generate a report about the history of the term artificial general intelligence. And he describes the meaning of artificial general intelligence as machines that can do anything the human brain and mind can do. He says, it went away for 10 minutes, it consulted 36 sources, and returned a 7 or 8 page report about the intellectual history of the term. And it was really good. It went all the way back to 1956 to the Dartmouth workshop where the term artificial intelligence was coined. It went back even further to the 17th century when Thomas Hobbes was talking about how reasoning was akin to computation. So it just traced the entire intellectual history of this term, and I didn't see anything obviously wrong with it. That's Kevin Bruce. Okay, I swear this isn't a talk about AI replacing the job of the historian. But what's striking to me about this clip is it actually represents the popular notion that Western thought has historically embraced, the idea that human brains, brain operations act like calculating machines. So to quote the Hobbes reference more fully, to reason is to collect a sum of many things added together at the same time, or to add or to subtract. And there are many such conceptual breadcrumbs one can extract to tell a history that seems to affirm this mirroring narrative. So what of replacement? I've talked about the mirroring and replacement narrative. The economist Daniel Susskind recently published an essay titled, "What Will Remain for People to Do?" And he is, of course, referring to that supposedly imminent time when AI is, quote, able to perform all economically useful tasks more productively than human beings. And this is another popular definition of AGI. Suskind's essay uses the word task 150 times in 5 pages. And he's self-reflexive about this. He explains that a task is considered by economists as the right unit of analysis for exploring the impact of technology on work, rather than the job being the optimal. We have to consider of the selection of tasks, though, as a unit by which to analyze cognitive labor, which is explained to be a way to read how technologies replace workers, but I want to question actually, is this the route by which we start to conceive of all human activity as replaceable in the first place? So I want to take a moment to ponder what I see as a paradox. The faculty of generality with respect to intelligence is by definition oppositional to task-based cognitive work. The latter indicates the habit-based execution of an already thought-out plan. The former references the capacity to synthesize, to abstract, analogize, to plan, anticipate, and otherwise design a system that includes tasks. So Suskind's essay does implicitly speak to a condition that many of us may also be responding to, and that is the consideration that this moment we're living through is one of transformative historical change. I say qualitative change. So the mirroring and replacement narrative and its emphasis on calculative task-based reasoning cannot explain this kind of qualitative transformation. And our advanced algorithms, to the extent that they're performing any certain kind of agent behavior, are not agents of history. So in this talk, I'll recover a phenomenon which I call fringe consciousness that is discussed tangentially by the 19th century philosopher psychologist William James. And so I'm sort of putting it together from his main magnum opus, Principles of Psychology. And this idea of fringe consciousness actually is kind of permeates throughout the text, though it was largely overlooked by those scientists and philosophers who built on James in the 20th century. Nonetheless, I think it provides a fresh intellectual tool for these current debates for framing what we might mean as human agency today. Fringe consciousness is a feature of human beings' sense organs having the capacity to take in much more information than one can perceive at any given moment. It is a vague awareness of the potentiality of seeing one's present conditions as otherwise, of radical changes in perspective. So Hubert Dreyfus, the philosopher, very briefly references James's fringe consciousness, and I do borrow the term from him, in his 1970 book, What Computers Can't Do. He offers a helpful example of a chess game. The fringe consciousness, Dreyfus explains, quote, resides in the area which tends to function in the background because it extends indeterminately around the central object of attention. Chess players, for example, zero in on any area formerly at the fringes of consciousness to discover gaps and introduce novel gameplay and sort of see a new pattern through which they can as a game. So we might also take as an example the effect of this Gestalt image, the Rubin face, where foreground and background oscillate. Our attention is such, our human attention system is such that we're not simply filtering out the background. We see the foreground on behalf of the background and vice versa. So now chess and the Chinese game Go are longtime favorite simulation sites for AI, and AIs have beat human players. So we might ask, what gives? Task complete. But fringe consciousness is not combinatorial, and it's peculiar. I am very interested in this concept because I think it's quite exceptional. It both alerts us to the possible limits of formal computer modeling, and it does not by definition oppose the possibility of brain-based representation. And it's a concept that emerges directly from James' understanding of brain logic. So this is not from James's own experiments with spiritualists and whatever. It's actually very fundamentally coming out of scientific research. It simultaneously explains the phenomenon of qualitative cognitive change, or what we might call breakthrough, insight, or personal historical rupture. Fringe consciousness emerges for James out of two aspects of his research. The first is his critique of associationism, British empiricist proposition that all higher order thinking arises from discrete sense experiences and elemental ideas that combine in the mind. The main figure of James was John Locke, but he also cites Hobbes as an originating figure in this school. The second is James's engagement with the cutting-edge brain science of the day, and it was really in this period that the concept of connectionism emerged. So James and his contemporaries understood that a distinguishing feature of the human nervous system is the extent to which it lacks organization on birth. Sense experiences subsequently inform the organization of one's neural pathways. That lack of organization is considered to be a very distinguishing feature of human brain and nervous system. Now we might consider how the philosophical concept of associationism and the connectionist physiological understanding of brain seem to go hand in hand. Mind and brain come together. And indeed, this marriage has been embraced by prominent figures in the history of computing and cybernetics, such as Donald Hebb and Norbert Wiener. More recently, in the 1980s, as connectionism was again being embraced by computer scientists, researchers at Johns Hopkins were arguing that William James is the originator of the computational neural network concept. So they quote James directly, who described human reasoning as the effect, quote, when two elemental brain processes have been active together, this is reasoning, and he's talking about the brain, have been active together or in immediate succession, one of them, on reoccurring, tends to propagate its excitement into the other. The amount of activity at any given point in the brain cortex is the sum of the tendencies of all other points of discharge into it. Such tendencies being proportionate to the number of times of excitement, the intensity, the absence of any rival point into which that discharge might be diverted. So the engineer authors explains that James's framing offers a way to quantify and model associative memory. They say, quote, James seemed to foretell the notion of a neuron's activity being a function of the sum of its inputs with past correlation history contributing to the weight of interconnections. So now in James's two-volume Principles of Psychology amply covers this phenomenon of neural pathway propagation. Yet this analysis here, these 1980s computer scientists, gets James wrong too, as his overarching theory of human psychology critiques associationism. So a particular target for James is John Locke's principle of contiguity, which holds that simple ideas or individual sense impressions once felt are subsequently fixed in the mind. Ideas once experienced together would share an association so that one remembered would evoke the others in a sequence. And James refers to this as a metaphor, simple ideas being train cars that sort of go into sequence as a train. James took issue with Locke's law, however. In Principles, he says, quote, the whole historical doctrine of psychological association is tainted with one huge error, that of the construction of our thoughts out of the compounding of the sounds together, of immutable and incessantly recurring simple ideas. We're going to deconstruct that for a little bit here. So James counters by both clarifying what he sees as a logical error and integrating the recent brain science. So instead of simple ideas, James says, it is things that are associated in the mind. These are sense references to actual material objects in the world that are discrete, which we perceive as such. We perceive them as discrete. But he goes on, and so far as association stands for a cause, it is between processes in the brain, and it is these which, by being associated in certain ways, determine what successive options shall be thought. So instead of taking the form of a train, ideational processes are for James streams, and this is a popular idiom, stream of thought. So even while the objects of consciousness are concrete and distinct, thought itself can be diagrammatized as continuous with all other segments of the subjective stream. So with things perceived, we have thought as a time-based continuous process, and yet there's still the problem of compounding, trains and sort of repetition. Trains and streams alike tend to traverse the same path over time. So how does this model not result in passive repetition and thought patterns that become automatic? So even James is working through his own update to the law of contiguity and asserts that it expresses merely a phenomenon of mental habit, which coincides with the law of the habit of the nervous system. And here we have images of how James thinks about habit. They're sequential, and you can think of it as you pick up your toothbrush in the morning, and you don't have to think about the sequence of activities that happen after that, because we have this sort of memorized in our body memory, and that habits of thought can be very similar. So for James, habit is a direct factor, actually, of an opposite quality, the human brain's plasticity, so the fact that that lack of organization that the innate brain has. James explains, quote, man is born with a tendency to do more things than he has ready-made arrangements for in his nerve centers. Therefore, habit serves to economize the expense of nervous muscular energy. Otherwise, we would be lost, right? So habit is actually very useful. As one learns, the central nervous system and its respective neural pathways become increasingly determined. Neural habit would later get described by Donald Hebb as, quote, neurons that fire together, wire together. But if we take this to its logical conclusion, with time the brain and mind would become increasingly automatic. There needs to be some counter force. How else would we have faculties like insight and imagination that take us to truly novel places? If habits are learned automatic behaviors of the brain and mind, not innate ones, James thanks to this, these processes can undergo a refashioning. Thinking exists at the threshold of habituation and plasticity, and I believe that fringe consciousness is actually the most sort of concise way to describe this counter force. Fringe consciousness is that mediator between habit and plasticity. It maintains the possibility of meaningfully altering and interrupting the neural synaptic runs most typically traversed. So if the human senses, brain and mind, and effector organs all have the capacity to do more than any single moment allows them to do, consciousness is then what James calls a selecting agency. To make a selection about what to focus your eyes on, what to think about, or how to interact with your surroundings is a foundational form of agency. It seems quite simple, but this capacity actually relies on an even more fundamental property, and that is the quality of plenitude, of having more than, or the possibility of selecting otherwise. So this vast field of possibility tends to operate in the background of consciousness, not as the focal point of attention, but it is always there. So by what means can it be accessible? Associationists conceived of thoughts as having determinate edges and one-dimensional sequences, as being total in themselves. But James argues that when objects perceived or remembered enter our consciousness, they are fringed or endowed with a porousness. And I want to show these because this is like a very difficult concept to visualize, and it's not explained by these images scientifically, but I'm showing them as a sort of metaphorical aesthetic representation of kind of what I'm talking about, and James's work preceded this brain research by 20 years or so. And the fringed object of consciousness is not, the sort of shape of the neuron. And yet, it seems that James sort of had an intuition about these forms of the nervous system that had not been represented until 20 years after his text was published. So this is a sort of idea of like a fringed mental object. In this 1884, in James's 1884 essay on some omissions of introspective psychology, where he initiates discussion of the fringe object, James references the example of Francis Galton's blended images as actually a misleading representation of the notion. That's kind of why I'm showing this as an alternative. The fringed object is not but a blurring sensation or a concept that lacks precision. Instead, fringe consciousness is what he says is the mysterious plus, the staining, fringed, or halo of obscurely felt relation to masses of other imagery to come, but not yet distinct. It is that field of possibility. And for James, it has a neural, it does have a neural counterpart, even though he's speaking very minimally at this time, because that's what the science was. His hypothesis is that the neural counterpart is a lot of dawning and dying processes that kind of go around the neural synapses that are too faint and too complex to be traced. So this fringe quality endows the object perceived or conceived with the potentiality to combine with any other sorts of objects in all sorts of different ways at any given moment. As such, thought retains the potentiality of being other than what it is at any given moment. And one other way we can think about this is the stream, but not just the stream, but the stream in a sort of, in weather, right? The weather around the stream that kind of might interact with it and sort of produce a field of forces that are hard to track in themselves. If objects are fringed, what are the implications for thought patterns or streams of thought, and how then are they not simply neural traces getting repeatedly traversed? So how do we change? Hobbes had described the higher orders of the mind as exclusively in this sort of binary relation of regulated thought to be distinguished from thought that is unguided or without design. But whenever we conceive not just of an object, but of an overarching design, and James gives examples of when you're watching an opera, but you kind of get this sense of the form of the total opera, or the notion of a scientific or philosophical system in total, or even the overall structure of one's own thinking. It appears to us as what James calls a shadowy scheme. It is both at one time definite, intensely active and determinate, and necessarily vaguely conceived. And James adds to this an affective dimension, giving the example of feeling a gap in one's thinking, such as a name not recalled or the right chess move not yet grasped. One experiences, quote, a mere feeling of harmony or discord, of a right or wrong direction of the thought. So fringe consciousness breaks down the thoughts binary of regulated thought and unguided thought. For James, regulated thought alone would only ever be inside of its own design. Fringe consciousness gets us beyond a temporal problem associated with directed thinking and volition. We'd only ever get to a destination we can conceive of in advance. Fringe consciousness is both with design and enables access to that unguided quality of plasticity and of potentiality, discovery, of invention. So I'll stop there, but I'm happy to talk in the Q&A about the relation of this to later work in cybernetics and even like reinforcement learning today, how we change in the neural network.
I get to introduce Hank, our last speaker for the day. So Hank Gerba holds a PhD from our very own Stanford's Film and Media program within the Art and Art History department. Their work focuses on media aesthetics and AI. Currently, Hank is a researcher at the University of Southern California, combining narrative theory with generative AI. So welcome.
Okay, I'm gonna try and go fast just so we can get to Q&A. So the question this talk poses is, what does artificial intelligence signal about the activity of images today? I'm going to approach this from a Simondonian account of what images are. It's actually going to relate a lot to what you just said, which is awesome. But let's begin elsewhere. In this case, a hunch is as apt an impulse from which to begin as any other. When Twitter X user @vplasma_ reposted a video of a cat jumping into someone's lap, they commented that this video feels AI generated even though it isn't IDK. That's the part, right? So commenters dot this post, this is like a 200,000 likes or something. Commenters dot this post with potential explanations. Here, peruse those. So there's something in this feeling which contains the impetus of a formal and indeed genetic pressure applied to by artificial intelligence to the category of images themselves. And in the same way that both Freud and Jung realized that rumor could, and often does, perform with great accuracy the work of the psychoanalyst, so too do the comments surrounding this video reveal the critical elements at play. There might be some similarity between the phenomenon of having the impression that a video is AI generated and the proclamation that a certain event witnessed is just like a movie. But whereas the latter seems to serve a primarily discursive function, a comment on the eruption of a typically cinematic image as event into everyday experience, the comment that a video or image feels AI generated seems to be more of an embodied kind of disorientation, something approximating a kind of mild nausea or a vertiginous pleasure, depending how you look at it. Of course, there's no escaping the discursive comment here. The veracity of the image, its indexicality, its political influence, and many other facets are at play when the question of whether or not an image is generated by AI is posed. That both these genres of comment turn around the polysemic and medial promiscuity of images is clear. My claim here is that whereas the cinematic image sutured the imagination to a mechanism in order to produce a moving image, AI externalizes the very imaginative mechanism itself, staging strange collisions between this capacity across what Shane has called the anthropotechnical interface. So why does this feel AI generated, or why does somebody say that it does? I don't know if it does to you. Simondon provides us a very clear answer, at least for understanding the feeling itself. There's a unique discrepancy between two things: the image object on the screen and the image within us which receives that sensation. So what's the difference between those two things? I want to prime the word image here because Simondon uses it in a very atypical way. When pursuing a Simondonian account of images, it's best to begin by thinking about the domain of mental images, processual contents of the imagination, rather than images in the sense of image objects, like photographs or stills, frames, or paintings, that kind of thing. So while we will be concerned with the image objects which are generated from AI systems, I will actually primarily be interested in analyzing these systems as themselves images. Simondon describes images in their processuality in the way that they seem to sometimes defy consciousness and assert themselves variously as parasites, pseudo-organisms, and as mycelial networks. These are metaphors he invokes to try and get at this sort of slippery quality of images where they seem to do their own thing. Which, if you've ever had like a horrifying image from a movie stuck in your head, I feel that's my, like I sometimes in the window like see the horror frame or whatever. So this is in part what differentiates images for Simondon. They are only incidentally available to consciousness, only partially yoked to it. And it's in this sense that I'm keen to say that AI systems are usefully thought of in the same way that we think about viruses in a way. Objects which are absolutely passive to their milieu and only activating when presented with a precise stimulus. These are structures which activate deracinated metabolic pathways. In the case of AI systems, these metabolic pathways are not biological, but those of the imagination. So in invoking the image of the virus, I don't mean to assign these machines the kind of virality in the sense that they spread all over the place across the population, though that might be relevant, but rather in the sense that viruses are objects which interface metabolic pathways while lacking in certain important characteristics, other features of what we call living systems. So I want to describe these systems, AI systems, as sort of crystallized metastabilities, which is itself a paradox. They're potent metabolic actors whose mode of operation is functionally analogous to that of the imagination. The claim here is that there's something of a trick or a paradox when it comes to AI images. While it's true and fascinating that they generate image objects with formal and semantic capabilities, unlike any other image generation technology, they should be analyzed with all the sort of methods we have to analyze image objects. I want to argue that AI systems such as diffusion models are interesting primarily because they are themselves images in this processual Simondonian sense. They are a crystalline, deracinated imagination. So how do we get to that idea? How do we get to that claim? So let's build up an intuition for the Simondonian account of images by tracing the first two stages of the image through a few sort of slices of this video. For Simondon, images are this kind of metabolic process which move from imagination out into the world and invention back into, so it's this sort of looping thing that's mediated by images. So here's a basic definition of the image for Simondon. Quote, what characterizes the first stage of an image is that it is a local endogenous activity. And this activity exists just as much in the presence of an object in perception as it does before experience, as anticipation, or afterwards as memory symbol. The difference between experience as a whole and perception as a subset of that. In the second phase of the image, he says that, quote, the image becomes a mode of receiving information coming from the milieu and a source of response schemas to these stimuli. In perceptual motor experience, images become effectively and directly functional. They organize and stabilize themselves in internally correlated groups according to the dimensions of the relationship between the organism and its milieu. The image in this stage is thus an organizational schema. The second stage is an organizational schema, a latent tendency which is not activated by the milieu in the sense of stimulus and response, but which allows for the organism's relation to its surrounding. It welcomes or furnishes perception as an organized element of experience. Interestingly, the first stage of the image is a motor image, an effective anticipation and an organization of movement. For Simondon, motoricity precedes sensoriality. Always thinking genetically, he evidences this claim by referring to the autokinetic motor behavior of unicellular organisms with no organized perceptual system. This endogenously pursued autokinetic image within the organism, these single cell guys, has no objective correlate because they have no perceptual system that's organized. It is the fundamental schematization which enables the organism to synthesize its activity as the activity of an organism as such. So Simondon calls that the body schema. And for him, this is the a priori image. This is the image at the root of all of us. Images in this stage are therefore pre-perceptual, a consequence of this being that, as far as images in this first stage are concerned, perceptual resemblance of a situation is much less important than its motor adequacy. So what does that mean? Play, as a category of activity, makes this clear. Simondon writes that, quote, a young cat capable of seizing with his claws and biting, but not of seeking and detecting prey, may take as prey substitute almost any kind of object, a bobbin with thread or a woolen ball, because the image of the prey remains. Foremost, a bundle of capture motions, the same almost random object may occasion different motor plays, capture, posturing, intimidation, etc. We see this image activated in the video. The toy obviously does not perceptually resemble prey, but it configures a milieu in which various motor images endogenous to the cat, such as stalking, posturing, striking, become adequate and available. So we have here represented in the video a motor image, that first stage of the image for Simondon. So moving past the cat. I'm gonna keep him up there so only you would know a trance. So let's shift registers to our perception of this image and that feeling that something is off. Off in a way that's particular to it sort of feeling like AI. So the second phase of the image is the intraperceptual image, where the a priori image of the body schema coupled with sheaves of images related to motoricity more directly interfaces perception. This is a continuity of the image activity, not a rupture. Simondon writes that, quote, in fact, in progressive perceptual motor behaviors, the role of the intraperceptual image is primordial. Since perception is given only at the end of an activity, at the moment of consummation, each preceding stage is founded on a sketch of perception, which is precisely the image. In the second stage, the image becomes a structure for receiving the stream of sensation and organizing it perceptually. It is a system for constantly validating the difference between incoming sensorial data and the relevant features of the world thereby generated. The image is the system of composability of states, in other words. He writes that, quote, the image here is like a virtual object whose appearance in this or that place is anticipated from the surroundings and from the continuum of size, color, and form. When the object appears, it is in relation to these images. It is then that it is grasped. Perception is then already, in this case, differential and comparative. So there's always this thing going on in the organism where the image is comparing against sense and sort of endowing sense with the possibility of the perceived object or something. Lots of parallels to this thing in any other kind of schematization structure you might like Kant or whatever. So we can say that this is that it is this slew of intraperceptual images which we all contain within us that is disturbed in some particular way by this video. By extension, disturbs these images within us in a way which seems to correspond to the certain qualities of image objects produced by AI. Simondon says, quote, confronted by an unknown situation, the subject first falls back on an activity from the primary level. That is to say, these image objects cause us to fall back onto that a priori body schema with its primary motor and kinetic modes of organization, that sort of disembodied, or the motion and the space is like the thing that gets triggered here. Because the image object produced by AI do not stem from a body schema, because they have no body, their renderings of space, relation, form, and movement are, to greater and lesser extents depending on the model and the architecture, clashing with these deeply held images. So let's consider AI systems themselves, jumping from stuff that's not to stuff that is. The final stage of the image for Simondon is invention, where the image is exteriorized from the organism, affecting its technical milieu, and in some way or another folding back into the organism's endogenous image, and that starts the process all over again. I'm going to be exclusively talking about diffusion models here, which are the kind that are used currently for processing and generating perceptual data, they call it, so images, video, sound, not text. The textual corollary is the autoregressive model. That's like what runs ChatGPT and stuff. I'm not going to talk about that. I don't want to do a genetic reading of these particular architectures, as the contingencies which shape them are only partially related to their success in producing outputs. There are other serious determinants here, such as the cost of computation, temporal efficiency, business scalability, and many others, which would make it naive to just suggest in any way that diffusion models in particular, as they currently are right now, have in some sense evolved or honed in on imagination in any way. That doesn't have to be a bad way. So what are these systems? They are, in essence, and I'm sure you've heard this many times, processes which numerically extrapolate features of a great number of images, projecting these features into a structure which we commonly refer to as latent space. That's the sort of common way to refer to it, or an abstracted precursor of all possible image objects that the model might ultimately produce. Like a virus, these trained models do absolutely nothing until they're presented with a very specific input, which is a Gaussian noise field of precisely the dimension, pixel dimension that they're expecting. It treats this noise field as an image. Noise field as an image object which has had noise applied to it. So this is the way we talk about it anyway. That it treats it like there was an image that got corrupted. Assuming that there is an image object there to be found, through an iterative process, the model traverses this latent space with the goal of successively removing noise from the supposed image object until at last something recognizable appears, like this red panda. What is particularly interesting about diffusion models is that the traversal algorithm models the expectation, getting back to that fundamental part of the motor image, the expectation or anticipation that an image will arrive after successfully denoising. In contrast to autoregressive models, it's not seeking out a specific next word. It's not anticipating a specific image object. In other words, its traversal through this latent space is primarily that. It's a traversal. Just to echo that early comment, motoricity here, traversal through this mathematical space, it's not literal motoricity, precedes sensoriality. The process then repeats. The perceived content of the iteratively denoised image is reconciled against the previous, and then the next sort of step in this space is taken. We might think of the trained diffusion model's latent space as a metastable technical schema. It contains within it not image objects, but the ground of an anticipatory system of imaginative activation, a technical analog to the organism's body schema, not awaiting representation, but a processual and mathematical analogon of motor engagement. So earlier I called this a crystallized metastability, which is an oxymoron. The entire point of metastability in Simondon's sense, and any other sense, I guess, is precisely the potential for decomposability into multiple states. It's not strictly crystalline. A crystalline structure would just be sort of one possible mode of resolution of a metastable system, like the illusion you showed. It crystallizes into one or the other. Yet trained diffusion models appear to embody exactly this paradox. Once trained, their technical schema are effectively crystallized, fixed in place. Invention no longer feeds back into imagination. The images in these systems are prophylactically sealed from environmental interaction, fundamentally unlike the ongoing cycle of images in which we, as embodied organisms, actively participate. In that fixity, we find a differential way of expressing the environmental concerns that many of us have with AI. The structure of their multi-stable decomposition is indicated in the process by which the data to produce them was gathered, the refinement through the labor of human reinforcement, and the capital regimes to which these systems are applied. So just my little pithy ending line here. So for Kittler, there was no software. Perhaps now, increasingly, there are no images, only a protected mode of imagination.
So we have around 30 minutes left for Q&A, and if you have not grabbed some charcuterie already, please do so. And if you haven't signed in already, this is...
Also, the original cat owner commented. Yeah.
That's great.
So it is a real cat. I didn't trick you.
Yeah, so we'll also take questions from the Zoom chat as well. So if there are any, then please feel free to either raise your hand or type them in and we can read them out loud for you. Right?
Yeah, I thank you all for these really, really stimulating talks. I have like 400 questions for each of you. So, yeah, there's going to be some sort of lossy compression that is coming out of my mouth in the next like 30 seconds or under, hopefully. But so I guess I will maybe just ask like a couple of questions that hopefully will speak to multiple, or at least one of the presentations, but particularly just sort of working backwards. Hank, talk, I guess, like, I don't know why, or if this was by design, but it seemed like there were, like, these were very good pairings, like, could have been a break to emphasize that. But also I had to, I had to run right between, so maybe that's just, anyway. But okay, so I guess just, I'm trying to think, like, especially thinking about this fringe model of consciousness that James is really emphasizing, seem to kind of interface in some way with this emphasis more on production and also a very limited mode of production. And there seems to be something going on here also with like, with object recognition, sort of aesthetics almost, where you have this cycle of objects with very well-defined contours being produced in order to sort of reinforce. So I don't know, maybe I don't know, we just heard about Simondon and now I'm in like Stiegler mode, which is like, you know, a bad place for me at times. So I guess I'm just thinking in a very general way, if like, what is this connection or this sort of like, it seems like there's some sort of link between this kind of fringe consciousness and a sort of fringe, like, exteriority, I guess. And I think that has a lot to do also with what maybe it is that you're looking for in Simondon. Because I guess, especially hearing the last presentation, I kept sort of asking what it is that Simondon provides here that like Bergson Deleuze wouldn't, for example, which is like, of course, just like much more trodden territory. And it seems to be something about this exchange, right? Because like, you know, you have all these strategic readings or misreadings of image ensembles that are really, really prominent, I think, in thinking about sort of like platform visuality. And I don't know, like, I guess just this exchange between sort of production and aesthetic reception. I would be interested in hearing maybe if the two sort of speak to each other. And then I guess just so I can like shut up sooner rather than later, the first two presentations, I was really struck by this sort of overlay of thinking about a kind of archaeology that came up that I know Johan kind of went in a different direction with, but I was still really struck by this sense of like there being something about these two. I don't know why, but well, I mean, I do know why, especially in the first talk, but I just kept thinking about Virilio, just like wandering the shores of Normandy and like complaining about like brutalist architecture while staring at these bunkers. And there seems to be like some sense of continuity here because he's talking about something that is being produced that and he's talking about this sort of like contemporary cultural politics that he is trying to sort of like create some interface with something that is sort of left behind on these shores. Like, I guess maybe the general question is just like, what about, where does forgetting happen in these two projects? And then like, is there something, what about archaeology, what about forgetting? I'm just gonna leave it there. Like, just, you know, do the, like 18-year-old, I've never been in a seminar before, what about this? But twice. Sorry? Oh, that was way longer than 30 seconds.
Do you two want to give it a go first?
I mean, I was just thinking of some really, really good examples of like the sort of, thank you for the questions, and additional ways to connect them all, but just like the motor aspect of the is really interesting. For James, all consciousness is a motor. But today I think of it as like the, you know, just IP and film production, for example, and like the taking aesthetic risks is like not something we see in popular culture, or we maybe do in social networks, but nowhere with the real investment. I've also heard friends talk about the sciences, like applying for funding needing to know that they will land at a certain destination before they start, which actually undermines the scientific method, right? So those are just some basic examples of kind of what I'm sort of this like imposition of habitual code. And I'll just stop there.
Yeah, well, the only part of your thing that stuck in my head was the why Simondon question, which is interesting, because there's like this Simondon and then there's technical Simondon. And to do this, I didn't think of him at all, really. And because all of this thought is focalized in this one word, imagination and extension. And so I think if I were to continue this specifically to think through these systems as images in this way, I would bring that other sort of more technically focused side of his work in, and that I think between these two sort of lines of thought he has, there's just a unique way that it crosswires relative to the other theorists you mentioned. So that's kind of why I've been drawn to him for this purpose, I think.
I'll just very quickly say, the bunker is interesting because it's a subtractive space. Or you could even think of it as an offset space or an offset image, because the whole point is you want to say this little tiny cubicle, I'm going to carve it away from time and space. So it's like the cryogenic tube in a way. Everybody knows that Sam Altman's already booked this spot, and they even have investment firms so that when you come back from your cryogenic sleep after 1,000 years, you've invested some of your money so that you're not a poor person, heaven forbid, when you come back. So there's all these mechanisms that have to acknowledge that you cannot subtract or negate or offset completely from the world around you, but you're nevertheless trying to, right? So the bunker, I think, exemplifies something about that mechanism of traversing a border. And I see that in your images or your voices as well. Again, it's about traversing a border and bringing something back from the absolute form of subtraction or removal, which is death. And there's always something else you have to do. When you want to bring something back and reconnect it, you're also bringing in that absence again. And when you want to set yourself apart and bunker away, you've also got to remain connected in some way, right? For electricity or what have you.
Yeah, just very, very quickly, on this notion of super archaeology, I've been also working with another guy, psychiatrist and medical doctor and AI pioneer. His name is Ken Colby. And so right around the time that Moravec is talking about this opportunity to what I would call data vitalism, that's how the dead rise from their data. He says, he's been working with this adjacent themes for decades, and he says, well, actually, there's a pretty, if we go down that route, there's a serious risk that we're gonna put memories where they weren't any in the first place, and what are we gonna do that? So I guess with dead bots, you might find yourself in a situation where you, well, first, because you're in a conversation with this presumably or simulation that's gonna imitate a dead person, you will keep having a conversation with them, but they're not around anymore. So you will start creating new memories together with this bot about something that isn't in the past, but it is also kind of not here, and that's confusing. And also, that's one thing, right? But you will, on account of the deceased person, you will also like pull memories that were never part of that person's life, and so it's both for the user and for the person who's not there anymore. The question of memory certainly becomes fraught with all kinds of difficulties.
I just had a horrible thought, and that is the archive of a loved one getting corrupted with synthetic data and not being able to tell that what was theirs and what was produced by the AI. And like, that's just, I don't know why that just triggered like a very strong emotional reaction.
We had it this week, right, where there was I think it was a murder case, and then the sister of the murdered person wrote in a talking chatbot version of this guy saying, "I forgive you." And this is this ultimate case of, synthetic memory. And there's an unverifiability at the heart of it that you can never resolve. So this is not a truth that you can confirm in any way, no matter what you know about the model. You can never say this is what they would have said, or no, it is not.
Thank you all so much. This was so expertly curated. I loved the order and everything. I think if there were like a through line, I think the notion of plenitude, all of your approaches kind of depend on that, whether it's the social ruin to the metabolic schema. I guess my question is for Johan and Hank, is there a way in which the deadbot as you're framing it versus the EVP, the deadbot has a certain kind of fidelity that makes it less laborious for the user in terms of perception, etc. But is that potentially a product of this, like a presentist reading of what the deadbot is? If we were to take Hank's notion of like the non-image, but like our perception of the image and transfer that to more of the sonic with the chatbot. Perhaps in the future, it would feel like a very noisy system, the deadbot. It's not the smooth system that it is represented in the model that you're presenting compared with historical ideas of sonic automation. So I don't know, is there a way to like kind of put your schemes in dialogue in the sense? I mean, I'm thinking about like early phonographic recordings were thought of by the public as like amazing, like you could actually hear Mary Had a Little Lamb or something. Whereas now we would be like, that's like there's nothing audible in there. So is that how the deadbot will read later in the future? Like, is an AI generated?
I had just one thought that came to mind, which when Simon Dunn's talking about this, he differentiates between symbols and symbols and it's not signs. Anyway, and he says an image is a symbol, and the important thing about a symbol is that it always has a sort of meaningful relationship to some element of reality, like a lock and a key. That's like a symbol for one does not mean anything in the world without the other. Whereas a sign or whatever the other word he uses is this kind of a denotative thing, and you could, find that in Perse or whatever. But the idea that these deadbots sort of are acting like a symbol in that way, they want you to feel like it has this real relationship to the deceased person, would mean that for Simon Dunn, like an image is activated when you're interacting with that, and that's probably the seductiveness of it. It's the sort of sheaf of accumulated images from that person's impact on you and the symbolic form that they take in those images. So that's just what I don't know. That's my thoughts.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean this is, where you're asking about the future. Where will we think about deadbots in the future? I think we, if you're a student of media history, you have to be humbled by what you come across in the archives. Like even if we look at what people said about digital photography in the 90s, or look at what people said about word processing in the 70s. Just to mention two examples, that are, we wouldn't think those necessarily as very, very problematic today. I mean, they were completely like, again, like the way we ended this session. That was like, that's the end of the image, obviously. I mean, what are we going to do here? There's nothing left, and it's, you know, we can make jokes about that now, but it was real. And also, you know, word processing is the end of writing, it's the end of even Western thought, as we know it. You know, and these are serious thinkers, just a few decades ago. So I think we have to be humble, right? I think we're gonna find all kinds of interesting ways to adapt to these technologies, you know, whether we like them or not, they're gonna be a thing. Is it gonna matter that they are originally modeled on a deceased person? For some people, maybe, and for others, it's just gonna be another way of doing like game playing or I think we're gonna see all kinds of interesting ways that they will be used. And so this is interesting too. So knowing that, how we're gonna because there's still a need to critique them, I think, on some level, and at the same time we have to be humble that this critique too will grow old, maybe quickly, and this is just something to balance, I think. Sorry, that's a very general answer, but that's what comes to my mind.
I have a question, I would say, I guess, mainly for Johan Sunha, which is how you see both the possibilities and pitfalls around fashioning a particular identity around the remains of something. You know, with Johan, I see you talking about, I can see like these dead bots as having a very particular like voice and tone and style versus, you know, just like a voice along the cable with EVP. And then Sunha, I think it's also the with ruins you show a lot of examples of these like these vested interest in fashioning a particular cultural identity around it. But then even with bunkers, I kind of find it interesting where bunkers, you know, have a vested interest in being shrouded in secrecy and, you know, like remaining under the radar. But even, I don't know if you were following that source, but I was just recently looking at Prehistory of the Cloud, and that, you know, there is the argument that even bunkers themselves as data centers are, you know, have this, are positioning themselves against, you know, like a racialized other in championing Western rationalist computing. And so I guess I kind of want to see both more discussion around both the potentialities and pitfalls, but also I think both of you somewhat fall on the side of saying this more particularity in a really reduced way, you know, is worse. And so I kind of want to push at that, like, are there ways in which more specificity around fashioning the remains around something can be productive or beneficial? And then also how you see that theme across both of your talks, like how you see the intersection.
Shall I start?
Go ahead. Yeah.
I think the key is that, so all of these different visions of the gleaming future that I showed are all incomplete, right? And some of them very openly so. But what I think is great about Ruin actually is that it really shows these contradictions or these impossibilities against the will of the creator, right? Often the creator cannot help it because they're long dead, right? The whole Ozymandias and so on. And so the reason I think about, and we see this in like the 18th century when there's a new romantic interest in ruins and people think of them as very positive things. And if you look at the rise of, I can't believe I'm going here in a room full of art historians, but when you look at people like Piranesi who are doing new innovative ways of drawing ruins, they don't try to be like photorealistic or accurate reconstructions. They try to fix or imagine what Roman architecture could have been like, or they superimpose those Roman ruins on modern Italian cities. And so ruins become a way to try and tell their own idealized story. And yes, you know, that can become another bad thing of reclaim Western civilization, blah, blah, blah. But I think ruins resist that reading a little bit because of that sedimented materiality. Whereas when you just depict the futures boldly on your PowerPoint slides, you can do so with maximum smoothness, and you can, you know, buzz away anything that interrupts your vision. But when you're forced to deal with anything that remains as a ruin, Benjamin calls this a second meaning. And you see this even with early internet, like to maybe give you a little bit of an in here, when we look back at the remainders of those older media that once were new, when we look at them now, we see a meaning or an aesthetics in them that were not visible to people at that time because of that sedimentation and because we've seen the ways in which they failed in some ways. And that's what I think is really valuable in a way that you'll never get when you just look at prototypes all day. I don't know, did I give you an